The real crisis is not the one you are watching on television. It is not the war in Iran. It is not the gas prices. It is not the elections. It is not the trade fights with Beijing. The real crisis is the one happening at a rate of $85,550 per second every second. While you sleep, while you work, while you commute, while you wait in line at the grocery store. Every second of every day, every second of this video. By the time you finish watching this analysis, the United States government will have added approximately $117 million to its national debt. Not over the year, not over the month, over the next 23 minutes. The total now stands at $38.91 trillion as of last Tuesday. The next trillion will arrive on or around the 18th of this month. The trillion after that, in approximately 147 days. The federal government of the United States is now spending more money servicing its past debts than it spends defending its own borders. Let that sentence land. This is not a partisan complaint. This is not a Wall Street talking point. This is what the Congressional Budget Office of the United States Congress published in February of this year, what the Joint Economic Committee published last Wednesday, and what the U.S. Treasury Department updates every single business day at fiscaldata.treasury.gov. The most powerful economy in the history of the world is by the numbers it itself publishes in a fiscal condition that has no precedent in the post-World War II era, and almost no one is telling you what comes next. This is not speculation. This is not partisan analysis. Every figure in this video comes from official, nonpartisan, or directly governmental sources. The U.S. Treasury Department's daily debt to the penny data set, the Congressional Budget Office's February 2026 Budget and Economic Outlook, the Joint Economic Committee's May 7th monthly debt update, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation's interest cost tracker, Bloomberg, Fortune, and the Bipartisan Policy Center's deficit tracker. When the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress publishes a number, that number is the official position of the federal legislative branch. When the Congressional Budget Office issues a projection, that projection is the constitutionally authorized fiscal forecast. We are not interpreting these sources. We are reading them aloud. Subscribe right now, because what we are about to walk through is the most consequential economic story of the next decade. And your cable news is treating it like routine background noise. Let us begin with the numbers. As of May 5th, 2026, the total gross national debt of the United States stands at $38.91 trillion. This figure comes directly from the Joint Economic Committee's monthly debt update published 2 days later. Relative to 1 year ago, that number is $2.7 trillion higher. Relative to 5 years ago, it is $10.75 trillion higher. In 5 years, the United States has added more debt than it accumulated in its entire history up to 1985. The pace broken down by the Joint Economic Committee is this: $7.39 billion per day. $307.98 million per hour, $5.13 million per minute, $85,550 per second. Read that last figure again, every second. Distributed across the American population, the debt now equals $113,792 per person, $288,676 per household. Every household in America on paper owes the equivalent of a comfortable suburban home and obligations they did not sign for, did not vote on individually, and cannot opt out of. But the headline number is not the crisis. The headline number is merely the symptom. The crisis is the interest. And here is where the story becomes something the previous decade did not contain. In fiscal year 2026, according to the Congressional Budget Office's February baseline, the United States will pay $1 trillion in net interest on its debt, not $1 trillion in principal, $1 trillion in interest alone. This is the first time in American history this threshold has been crossed. To put that number in perspective, the American Action Forum's analysis of the CBO baseline confirms that interest payments of $1 trillion will exceed the $885 billion the federal government is projected to spend on national defense and exceed the $708 billion projected for Medicaid. According to Fortune magazine's reporting in April of this year, citing CBO budget data, the service payments on public debt are roughly equal to spending for the same period on both the Department of Defense's military budget and the Department of Education. $88 billion per month in interest, $22 billion per week. For the first time on a sustained basis, the United States is paying more to service its history than to defend its future. We know more than this. We know what the trajectory looks like. The Congressional Budget Office projects that net interest payments will rise from $1 trillion in 2026 to $2.1 trillion by 2036, a 106% increase. Over the 30-year window through 2056, interest payments are projected to grow by 538%. We know that interest costs will exceed Medicare spending by fiscal year 2028. We know that they will exceed all discretionary spending, meaning every dollar Congress votes on for defense, education, transportation, scientific research, and federal law enforcement combined by 2038. By 2048, interest will be the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than Social Security, larger than Medicare, larger than everything. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation Tracker confirms it. The American Action Forum confirms it. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget confirms it. But we should be honest about what we do not know. We do not know whether interest rates will fall and offer temporary relief. We do not know whether a recession will compress yields and reduce the immediate cost. We do not know how foreign holders who control approximately $9.5 trillion of this debt will behave in a sustained downturn. And we do not know what the political response will look like when the choice between cutting Social Security and raising taxes becomes unavoidable, because the data suggests that choice is coming. What we do know is this: the debt to GDP ratio, according to the Wall Street Journal and the CBO, has now reached 100%. This is the first time since the immediate aftermath of World War II that this threshold has been crossed and held. The CBO projects it will reach 175% of GDP by 2056. The United States is not projected to reach $40 trillion in annual GDP until 2032, according to analysis published by Epic for America. The debt will reach $40 trillion before the end of calendar year 2026. The country will, in other words, owe more in absolute terms than it produces in a year, and the gap is widening. This is not a forecast. This is the present. You cannot simultaneously cut taxes, increase defense spending, and reduce the deficit. The arithmetic does not allow it. And yet the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025, which the Congressional Budget Office estimates will add $2.4 trillion to deficits over 10 years before interest, did exactly that, making permanent the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions, introducing new tax cuts, increasing defense and border security spending, and raising the debt ceiling by another $4 trillion. You cannot pressure the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates while running deficits that depend on the Federal Reserve's independence to remain credible to bond markets. And yet President Trump has spent the early months of 2026 publicly criticizing Fed Chair Jerome Powell for high interest rates, telling reporters in January that Powell cost the USA a fortune and continue to do so, even as foreign bond buyers were watching to see whether the Fed would buckle. You cannot tell the American public that tariffs are paying for tax cuts while the Congressional Budget Office publishes in May of this year that the tariffs, if they survive their legal challenges, would reduce deficits by amounts that are a small fraction of what the tax cuts themselves cost. You cannot do these things. And yet the administration's communication strategy has done all of them simultaneously throughout the spring. The contradictions are not rhetorical, they are arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike political messaging, does not negotiate. Consider the language being used in real time. The Joint Economic Committee, controlled by the same party that controls the executive branch, published last Wednesday a debt update that contains, in plain text, the phrase, "Assuming the average daily rate of growth over the past 3 years continues, the U.S. will reach $39 trillion by approximately May 18, 2026. That is 6 days from now. This is not the language of an administration in control of its fiscal posture. This is the language of a budget office documenting the speed of its own institution's drift. The federal government, as we record this analysis, has been in a partial shutdown since February 14, 2026, a shutdown triggered by the inability of Congress to agree on Department of Homeland Security appropriations. Bipartisan Policy Center analysis confirms it. The party in unified control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives cannot fund its own departments. And in the middle of this institutional paralysis, the debt continues to grow at $85,000 per second. What we are watching is not a political crisis. It is a structural one, and the structure does not respond to press releases. The administration's claim, repeated in various forms throughout the spring, is that strong revenue growth and tariff income are putting the United States on a sustainable fiscal path. As evidence, the Bipartisan Policy Center confirms that revenue growth has indeed been strong. Receipts for the first half of fiscal year 2026 totaled $2.5 trillion, an increase of $223 billion over the same six-month period last year. The administration is not wrong about this part. Let us acknowledge the partial truth. Tax revenue is up. Tariff revenue is up. Higher individual income tax collections on higher wages are real. The cumulative deficit for fiscal year 2026 through March was, in fact, $140 billion lower than the same period in 2025. This is not nothing, but it is the wrong measurement. The right measurement is whether revenue growth is keeping pace with the growth in mandatory spending and interest. And on that measurement, the answer is unambiguous. Outlays grew from $3.57 trillion to $3.65 trillion in the first half of the year. The deficit for the full year is still projected at $1.9 trillion, or 5.8% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits will exceed $2 trillion by fiscal year 2028 and grow to $3.1 trillion by fiscal year 2036. The blockade of revenue improvement is searching the House for fiscal intruders, finding tariff money in the bedroom and missing the interest payment family of 6 in the basement. The 2 in the bedroom are real. The family in the basement is the interest spiral the CBO has been warning about for 2 years. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, analyzing the same CBO baseline, identifies what they call the inflection point. Starting in fiscal year 2031, the average interest rate paid on the national debt is projected to exceed the economic growth rate on a sustained basis. When this happens, and the CBO baseline says it will happen, the United States enters what economists call a debt spiral. Interest costs increase, higher interest costs require higher borrowing pushes up interest rates further, higher interest rates depress growth, depressed growth further increases the cost of carrying the debt. The claim that tariff revenue and tax growth solve this is not a lie. It is something more dangerous. It is a true statement about a small part of the problem, deployed as if it were a true statement about the whole. There is another dimension to this crisis that does not receive the attention it deserves, and that is the slow recalibration of America's largest foreign creditors. According to Treasury International Capital data published in April of this year, total foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries stand at approximately $9.5 trillion. The 3 largest foreign holders are Japan, with approximately $1.24 trillion, the United Kingdom, with $897 billion, and China with $693 billion. Notice the trajectory on the third name. China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries peaked at $1.32 trillion in November 2013. As of February 2026, those holdings have declined by approximately 42%. According to Visual Capitalist's analysis published in February, China reduced its U.S. debt holdings by $86 billion between November 2024 and November 2025 alone, the single largest net seller among all foreign holders. This is not cowardice. The Chinese media will not frame it that way. The Trump administration may predictably dismiss it on social media. It will change nothing. What Beijing is doing is rational risk assessment. Their analysis is that the United States entered 2026 with an unsustainable fiscal posture and no political mechanism for correcting it. Their analysis has been correct for 42% of their original position. Japan has held steady within a narrow band. The United Kingdom has increased its holdings, though primarily through London-based dealer custody rather than sovereign accumulation. Saudi Arabia and Canada have been the most prominent recent gainers. The picture is not one of mass abandonment. It is something subtler, a quiet diversification away from concentrated U.S. exposure by sovereign actors who can do mathematics. This is what allied abandonment of a fiscal regime looks like. It does not come with announcements. It comes with monthly TIC reports that nobody reads. Now we come to the deeper structural failure. The American fiscal doctrine that has governed since the 1980s was built on 3 assumptions. First, that the United States dollar would remain the unrivaled global reserve currency, allowing the federal government to borrow at structurally low rates regardless of fiscal behavior. Second, that economic growth would consistently outpace interest rates, allowing the debt to GDP ratio to stabilize even with persistent deficits. Third, that political institutions would, in extremis, find compromises that prevented true fiscal catastrophe. All 3 assumptions are now under stress. The first assumption, Dollar dominance has not collapsed, but it has weakened. The dollar's share of global reserves has been slowly declining for over a decade. Central banks have diversified into gold at record rates. China's reduction of 42% in treasury holdings represents a deliberate policy choice by a major sovereign actor. None of this constitutes an end to dollar primacy, but it constitutes a margin of safety that no longer exists. The second assumption, that growth outpaces interest, is the one that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has now formally projected to fail. Starting in fiscal year 2031, on the CBO baseline, the average interest rate paid on debt is projected to exceed the rate of economic growth. This is the mechanical definition of a debt spiral. The math is not complicated. When the cost of carrying debt grows faster than the economy that supports it, the debt to GDP ratio rises automatically, regardless of fiscal policy. This is why the CBO's long-term projection has debt to GDP rising from 100% in 2026 to 175% by 2056. The trajectory is not a forecast of policy choices. It is a forecast of arithmetic in the absence of policy choices. The third assumption, that political institutions will compromise in extremis, is the one currently being stress-tested in real time. The federal government has been in partial shutdown since February 14, 2026, over Department of Homeland Security funding. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act added $2.4 trillion to projected deficits without offsetting cuts. The party in unified control of all three elected branches has not produced a budget reconciliation that addresses the structural drivers of the debt. Social Security, which has $25 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and Medicare, which has $53 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Together, those two programs alone represent $78 trillion in obligations, or roughly double the current gross debt. The unfunded liabilities are not abstract. They are the present value of promises the federal government has made to current and future retirees that exceed projected revenues to fund them. They are not on the official balance sheet. They are on the demographic balance sheet, which is more honest. Underneath all of this lies a more fundamental asymmetry. The political incentives in a democracy reward delivering benefits in the present and deferring costs to the future. Every elected official benefits from this trade. Every voter benefits from the present side of it. The future, which bears the cost, has no representation in any current election. This is not a failure of any individual administration. It is a structural feature of democratic time preference that compounds like interest over decades. There is a genuine constraint that deserves honest acknowledgement because presenting only one side would be the kind of analysis we criticize. The United States has unique fiscal capacity that no other major economy possesses. It borrows in its own currency. It has a Federal Reserve that can, in extremis, monetize debt without immediate sovereign default. It has demographic profiles that, while aging, are healthier than Japan's or much of Europe's. The argument that the debt is automatically catastrophic ignores the structural advantages the United States retains. But here is the strategic point. Those advantages do not eliminate the debt spiral. They postpone its consequences and change the form of those consequences. Instead of explicit default, the consequence becomes monetary debasement, sustained inflation, political pressure on the central bank, and the slow erosion of the dollar's reserve status. Japan, which has carried a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 230% for years, illustrates one possible outcome: a long stagnation, low growth, demographic decline, and gradual loss of economic dynamism. It is not a catastrophe. It is something arguably worse, a slow drift into irrelevance. That is the actual policy choice that nobody in Washington is willing to name publicly. The question is not whether the debt is sustainable. The question is what form the unsustainability will take. We should be honest about what the other side of this argument actually says, because it is not without merit. Steve Eisman, who correctly identified the 2008 subprime crisis, has argued that predictions of imminent fiscal catastrophe have been made continuously since the national debt was $10 trillion. None of those predictions has to date produced the catastrophe they predicted. Ben Carlson, in his May 7th column at A Wealth of Common Sense, made the same point. Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father, warned in the 1940s, when the debt was $50 billion, that America could not endlessly spend borrowed money without consequences. The debt has grown by a factor of nearly 800 since then. The consequences he predicted have not materialized in the form he expected. This is a genuine analytical challenge. The boy who cried wolf problem is real. Markets that have absorbed every previous round of debt warnings may continue to do so. Treasury yields, as Bloomberg's index showed in January 2026, have remained remarkably stable despite the alarming trajectory. But the response to that argument is also straightforward. The previous warnings were issued at debt levels that, in retrospect, contained significant fiscal capacity. The current warning is being issued at 100% debt to GDP, with interest costs at all-time highs as a share of revenue at a projected inflection point 7 years away when growth and interest rates cross. The previous warnings being wrong does not make the current warning wrong. It makes the current warning the one the previous warnings were rehearsals for. History does not have a good name for what happens when a great power's interest payments exceed its defense spending on a sustained basis. The closest analog is the British Empire in the decades after World War I, when interest on war debts and the cost of imperial maintenance began to consume revenue faster than the imperial economy could generate it. The British did not default. They inflated, they devalued, they retreated from commitments. They watched, decade by decade, as Washington and other capitals stopped treating sterling as the reference currency. The collapse was not loud. It was the steady accumulation of smaller failures that, in retrospect, could only have meant one thing. The American position in 2026 is not yet British in 1947, but the trajectory has more in common with that precedent than with any other moment in U.S. economic history. The interest exceeds defense crossover is the inflection. It is the moment the empire begins to be governed by its past obligations rather than its future ambitions. What comes next? The CBO's baseline projects debt at 117% of GDP by 2036 and 175% by 2056. Interest payments reaching $6.6 trillion annually by 2056. The Highway Trust Fund expires September 30th of this year. FY 2027 appropriations must be addressed in the coming months. The Department of Homeland Security shutdown enters its fourth month next week with no clear resolution. There are no easy options remaining. The arithmetic permits 4 solutions and only 4. Cut spending dramatically, raise taxes dramatically, grow the economy at rates not seen in a generation, or inflate the debt away. The first 2 are politically impossible. The third requires conditions that are not currently in evidence. The fourth has consequences that fall hardest on the working class Americans who can least absorb them. The question that nobody in Washington will answer publicly is which combination of these 4 they actually intend to use, because the data suggests they intend to use all 4, slowly, without admitting it, in the hope that the inflection arrives on someone else's watch. The total gross national debt of the United States is $38.91 trillion. It is growing at $85,550 per second. It will reach $39 trillion 6 days from now. It will reach $40 trillion before the end of this calendar year. The debt to GDP ratio is 100%, the highest since World War II. Annual interest payments will hit $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026, a record. Interest payments now exceed national defense spending, exceed Medicaid spending, and will exceed Medicare spending by 2028. Interest will exceed all discretionary spending combined by 2038. The federal government has been in partial shutdown since February 14th. China has reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings by 42% since 2013. The Congressional Budget Office projects a debt spiral inflection point in fiscal year 2031. Social Security has $25 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Medicare has $53 trillion in unfunded liabilities. The Joint Economic Committee, the Congressional Budget Office, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and the Bipartisan Policy Center all agree that the current trajectory cannot continue. That is the actual state of the United States fiscal posture. That is what no one is telling you on cable news. That is the crisis that is not waiting for a headline. And somewhere tonight in a Treasury Department server room in Washington, a clock is ticking. Every second, the federal debt of the United States grows by $85,550. The most powerful government on earth cannot stop it. The most sophisticated economy in history cannot outpace it. The political institutions designed to govern it cannot agree on a budget. The foreign creditors who once underwrote it are quietly walking to the exits. $1 trillion a year in interest alone, just to service the past. The future, which will have to pay it, has no vote in the room where the decisions are being made. We will keep tracking every development in this story, the monthly TIC data, the CBO updates, the Treasury releases, the Federal Reserve decisions, and the political fights that determine whether any of this can be addressed before the inflection arrives. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe and share it with someone who is still being told that the federal debt is somebody else's problem. It is your problem. It is in your gas tank, in your grocery bill, in the interest rate on your mortgage, and in every dollar you save for a retirement that will be paid in money worth less than the money you earned. $38.91 trillion, $85,000 per second, $1 trillion in interest. Join us Monday through Friday.